Hello and welcome to this Mythconceptions video from NET English, and we're focusing today on the poem Poppies by Jane Weir, which is taken from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. Now the mythconception we're going to deal with today, and it's just the single mythconception today, is very, very common in terms of classrooms across the country and also in terms of student interpretations. And it's this idea on the screen that the child in Poppies has died. So we're going to look at the arguments for, the arguments against, and try and draw some sort of conclusion as to what the right answer actually is. So the arguments for, now there is a logic to this in terms of the poem. So poppies in the poem, and the poem is called Poppies, are symbols, as we know, of death and remembrance linked to war, and the reference in the poem itself. Poppies had already been placed on individual war graves, and so on. There are references in the poem to death and to injury. War graves and spasms occur in the first few lines. There's also this ambiguity around the image of the songbird and the single dove. And an interpretation you often find linked to these is that the songbird being released and the single dove that leads her to the churchyard are images of some sort of spiritual connection, images maybe of the soul being released at the point of death, and so on. The link to the churchyard, I think, is one that people often latch onto. So when it says, for example, that the mother is skirting the churchyard walls, well, we know that churchyards traditionally are places where you would bury the dead. They're full of graves. So if she's visiting the churchyard, it would make sense that this is a place where perhaps her child has been buried. There's the focus in the poem on memory and the past, the war memorial, for example. So it makes sense to have this mother mourning her dead child, visiting a war memorial, which is about mourning the dead. And then, of course, there's the sense that this entire poem is about the sense of loss. And at the end of the poem, this line, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind, that the entire poem is about loss. So it makes sense that she would have lost her child in the sense of that child having died. Okay, so those are the arguments for this interpretation. What are the arguments against that interpretation? Well, there's quite a few on this one. Firstly, it's not clear in the poem that the child has gone off to active service, as in has gone off to actually go and fight in a war zone. So we're told that it is 3 days before Armistice Sunday. We get the details of the lapel and the yellow bias. Now, the uniform the child appears to be wearing is a dress uniform, and that's not what you wear when you're reporting for active duty. So in terms of the time and the uniform, actually what's more likely is that they're going off to some sort of parade, potentially, some sort of display, possibly some sort of rehearsal from a remembrance service, something along those lines. It's not even clear actually how old the child is. Is this a cadet? Is this a serving military officer on some level, serviceman? It's really, really unclear. So the way the person's dressed and the time frame don't actually lend themselves to this interpretation the child goes off to war. That links to the idea that nothing in the poem says the child has died. There's no reference to the child actually dying. And the mother doesn't go into the churchyard. Notice, she's skirting the churchyard walls. Now, what that seems to suggest is someone who's dealing with the idea of death, skirting the issue, sort of tentatively exploring the idea rather than dealing with the reality. So the mother is almost like avoiding the inside of the churchyard because that's a place where there is literal death, death to the past, graves. She's around the outside as if the death hasn't yet occurred, or there may not even be a death, but she is perhaps having to deal with the idea of it. The time frame seems really, really tight. A split second and you were away, intoxicated, we're told, and then immediately after you'd gone, and then later. Now, it is possible that after you'd gone is meant to imply a longer time frame, that later could be days, weeks, months, years, who knows. But actually in the poem, it feels really close together, and that would be an incredibly quick death to occur, especially when it happens off stage and unmentioned. There's the argument to be made that what the mother seems is worried rather than grieving. So her stomach in the poem, we're told, is making tucks, darts, pleats, little connections, right? Little moments. This is not someone who is overwhelmed by grief. It's someone who's dealing with tension, with nerves, with fear, with anticipation. And again, that would fit with almost like this preemptive readiness for grief that could happen rather than actual grief occurring. The mother in the poem is very, very clearly unprotected and vulnerable. She is without a winter coat, we're told. So she prepares her child, but is left to deal with her emotions herself. And it does make more sense, I think, for the poem to be interpreted that way. The poem is about the mother dealing with her emotions, dealing with the loss of the child as a child, and dealing with that separation that she then has to experience. And the focus, of course, in the poem is on the mother's emotional state. When she released a songbird from its cage, now that metaphorically reflects, of course, her having to set the child free, but also being able to release her emotions when the child has left. And the songbird from its cage could be about the child and their freedom, and it can also be, in parallel, the mother and her emotional release. The mother also, we're told in the poem, seems to find comfort and connection in the past and with the past. So when she traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, we get that physical connection which she cannot have with her child anymore. She has had to recognise the child's adulthood, respect them as an adult when they leave, unable to do anything more than simply clean the cat hairs off their uniform and pin the poppy on their lapel. But instead what she connects with is almost like the idea of the parents of the past, those grieving people from the past, those who've gone through the same thing. And again, it's maybe about the readiness she experiences. And I do think the poem is more about a loss of connection than about simply death and grief. Death and grief is simplistic. It's too obvious, too easy in some ways, for a poem which is very, very nuanced and quite subtle. I pinned one onto your lapel, sellotape bandage, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, want to graze my nose, the impulse to run my fingers. All of these are about the desire to reconnect with the child. And instead what we're left with is the mother having to make connections within herself. Tucks, darts, pleats, and the desire to reconnect with the child, the stitch, the playing around voice catching on the wind, catching as in threads catching. So the poem really is about the mother's emotional state. To refocus it on the death of the child really almost distracts and detracts from that interpretation. There's also this last idea, which is that the actual title of the poem in the collection in which it was published, the way I dressed during the Revolution, the poem wasn't called Poppies. It was called Cat Hairs on Your Trousers. And that's the reference in the poem, of course, white cat hairs. Now what that does is ensure that the interpretation of the poem is focused on this image of domesticity, the familial connection of the mother and the child. It's not a poem which is fundamentally about loss and war and death. And again, this really simplistic interpretation, this far too basic interpretation, which assumes that anything to do with war must be about death. And I think the AQA Poetry Anthology, the Parent Conflict Anthology, do make it very, very clear that it's far more nuanced and complex and a richer theme to discuss and think about than just simply being about death. As a final point, Jane Weir came to a conference that I was at a few years ago, and she was a phenomenal public speaker. She was fascinating and a wonderful, wonderful woman and a poet. But she answered the question from a student about whether the child in the poem was alive or dead. And what she made very, very clear was that she deliberately left the poem open to interpretation. So where does this leave us then? So the idea that in Poppies the child has died. Well, it's not as simple as a yes or a no. It doesn't say for definite that the child hasn't died in the poem. I do think, though, that a much more interesting interpretation is to engage with the ambiguity of it, to engage with the mother's emotional state, that preemptive grief for the potential loss of the child, and that direction is far, far more logical, that this is about the mother and her emotional state and her connection with people in the past who've gone through the same thing, rather than simply, the child is dead, the mother is sad. So there we go. The child in Poppies has died, and not really a clear yes or no answer on this one. but hopefully an interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your time today, and I will see you in the next one of these that we make.